All right, moving into our very first organ system. As we talked earlier in the semester, there are 11 or 12, depending on you organize, systems of the body. And I said we would cover most of them, not all of them, in great detail. This is the one we probably cover the most in depth. We'll spend 4 lectures, 3 of them in Unit 2, 1 in Unit 3, covering it. Structures that make up the nervous system are illustrated and identified here in this figure. Brain and spinal cord make up what we call the CNS, the cranial nerve, spinal nerve, sensory receptors in the skin are example of structures that are part of the PNS. Now, I'm going to explain what the abbreviations CNS and PNS are here in a second. But first, let's just kind of look at an overview of the structures. Includes the brain, which is made up of about 10 billion neurons. Neurons are the nerve cells that do all the nerve signaling. 12 pairs of cranial nerves that emerge from the base of the brain. So there's 12 pairs, 24 total. They're nerves that connect directly to the brain. Some of them go to our eyes. You're using those to transmit what you see right now into your brain. Some of them go to your ears. You're using those to process what you hear right now and carry that signal from our ears to our brain. Your spinal cord is a mass of nerve tissue located in the vertebral canal, connects the brain to our spinal nerves. And our spinal nerves, there's 31 pairs of those, so 62 total. They emerge from the spinal cord, serving the left and right sides of the body. Then you've got what we call ganglia, which are small, massive nervous tissue containing primarily the cell body's neurons. And they're closely associated with cranial and spinal nerves. We'll talk about what cell bodies are later in the lecture. Enteric plexuses help regulate digestion, so they control the secretion of glands from our stomach and intestines, the contraction of the muscle within the wall of the stomach and intestines, among other things. And then sensory receptors, which are either parts of neurons or specialized cells monitoring changes in the internal or external environment. Well, if we think back to our first lecture, when we talked about feedback, we really have already kind of talked about 2 of these structures. Okay, remember there's 3 components to a feedback loop, right? Sensors or receptors, literally what's listed at the bottom of the page there, sensor receptors. Okay, we talked about the example of walking outside when it's cold. Okay, sensor receptors in your skin detect that change in temperature and they transmit that input signal to the control center. What did we say the control or integrating center often is? An area in your brain. Okay, and then we send an output signal to our effectors, right? The effectors are like muscles or glands that produce a response. Well, muscles and glands are not part of the nervous system, but guess what? They're controlled by nerves. And we've got spinal nerves, we've got cranial nerves that transmit that signal away from the brain to those effectors. Okay. And that actually kind of leads me right here to our 3 functions of the nervous system. Now, these are the 3 most basic functions of our nervous system as a whole. What we call the sensory function, the integrative function, and the motor function. The sensory function involves those sensory receptors detecting an internal stimulus, such as an increase in blood acidity, or an external stimulus like a raindrop landing on your arm. Okay, the type of neurons that serve this function are classified as sensory neurons. They're called sensory neurons because they perform the sensory function. Another term for them are afferent neurons. Okay, we'll talk about the different types of neurons later in the lecture. Okay, so when you feel cold or when you feel hot or when you touch something that hurts, you're interpreting the sensory function. Okay, the integrative function is where we process that information. The word integrate means to process that sensory information by analyzing and storing some of it and by making decisions for appropriate responses. Okay, so this involves our brain, typically anyway, deciding what to do with that sensory information. Like when we go outside and it's cold and we say, hey, it's cold, and what do we do as a response? Put on a coat, but what else do? We shiver. Okay, your brain integrates that information, processes that cold information, and decides, okay, what do I do with it? We don't sweat, thankfully. We decide to shiver. Okay, now an important integrative function is perception, which is being consciously aware of sensory stimuli. Okay. When we say consciously aware, we mean like we mentally are aware of it. Okay. Like we feel it. Okay. We sense it. Do we have conscious awareness of every sensation occurring to the body? No. Okay. Going back to an example of sensory function, we feel when a raindrop lands on our arm, correct? We feel when we touch something hot. We feel when we're tickled or when we're itchy. Can you feel and are you mentally aware when your blood acidity changes? No, it'd be pretty cool if we could, but we can't. Okay. And that's because a lot of what takes place is just automatically processed for us. Okay. Type of neurons that perform the integrated function are called association neurons. I usually call them interneurons. Okay. Same thing, just two different names. And then finally, the motor function is the division or the response. Okay. So this is what elicits the appropriate motor response by activating or inhibiting the effectors. Once again, effectors will be our muscles and glands by way of those cranial and spinal nerves once that sensory information is integrated. So in other words, the motor function is like the signal leaving our brain, traveling to our muscles and telling them to shiver, or traveling to our sweat glands and telling them to sweat. Okay. They don't produce the response, but they're carrying it the signal that eventually results in a response. Okay. The type of neurons that serve this function are called motor neurons because they perform the motor function. Also go by the term efferent or efferent. Okay. The three basic functions of the nervous system occur, for example, when you answer your cell phone after hearing it ring. The sound of the ringing phone stimulates sensory receptors in your ears. That's a sensory function. This auditory information is subsequently relayed into your brain where you process it and decide whether you should answer the phone. There's the integrated function. Brain then stimulates contraction of specific muscles, allowing you to grab your phone and press the appropriate button to answer it, which is demonstrating the motor function. All right, the intricate billion or network of billions of neurons and even more neuroglia, which are supporting cells, can be organized into two main subdivisions. So in other words, all the structures and all the cells of our nervous system, there's two main subdivisions, okay? What we call the central and the peripheral nervous system, okay? The central nervous system is the structural and functional center of the entire nervous system and consists of the brain and spinal cord, okay? If you abbreviate central nervous system, what you have is CNS, and that's what this box here is representing, okay? Major function of your central nervous system is to integrate or process and act as the command center of the entire nervous system, okay? Number one in charge will be your brain, and then number two in charge will be the spinal cord. Typically, your brain is doing the integrating and processing, okay? Sometimes it's the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system, or PNS for short, consists of nerve tissues that lie in the periphery or outer regions, in other words, beyond the brain and spinal cord. It consists of the cranial nerves and nerve branches carrying impulses to and from the brain, spinal nerves and nerve branches carrying impulses to and from the spinal cord, ganglia, which we said earlier, small masses of nervous tissue located outside the brain and spinal cord, and then sensory receptors, which are the dendrites of sensory neurons or specialized cells monitoring changes in the internal external environment. Okay. Now, we can then take the peripheral nervous system and we can subdivide it. And we organize it based on what effectors are being regulated. So who's being controlled, in other words. You have two main divisions. There's a third as well that we'll get into on the next slide, but we'll start and talk the most in this class about these two here, the somatic and autonomic nervous systems, okay? The somatic nervous system is associated with voluntary control, carries information to and from our skeletal muscle. There are a couple phrases in there I want you to highlight or underline. The first is voluntary control, And the second phrase is skeletal muscle. When I say voluntary control, I mean that I'm mentally, or you are mentally, purposefully doing the controlling, and you are aware that you are doing it. Okay, like you guys writing out your notes right now, you are purposely doing that, and you are sending that signal from your brain to your muscles and controlling them. What type of muscles? Skeletal muscles. Okay. Whereas the autonomic nervous system is associated with involuntary control and carries information to our autonomic effectors. Okay. Now that word autonomic sounds like a much more commonly used term, automatic. Okay. And I always like to emphasize that because you can say automatic is a lot like the term involuntary. Okay. Involuntary control means that we aren't consciously doing it, nor are we really consciously aware that it's happening. Okay. Can you sit there where you're sitting right now and say, with all your brain power and all your might, I'm going to start sweating? Can you speed your heart up? Can you make your heart beat harder?
Technically, yes.
You can do things that are going to alter it, but you cannot do that.
I can't physically, no.
You can do things like jump up and down.
Mhm.
That makes you sweat. That makes your heart beat harder, beat faster. But you can't physically, mentally do that. It's automatically done for you. Now, autonomic effectors, there's typically three. Cardiac muscle, which is in our heart. Smooth muscle, that's found in a lot of places. Stomach, intestines, blood vessels, the uterus, the bladder, and then glands, whether that's sweat glands, oil glands, or endocrine glands, etc. internally. Okay. You can also throw in as autonomic effectors adipose or fat tissue, and then some others. But typically, and I would highlight these three, will be what we classify as the autonomic effectors: cardiac, smooth muscle, and glands. They are the things that are being controlled by the autonomic nervous system. Now, the autonomic nervous system has what we call a sympathetic and a parasympathetic division. The sympathetic division produces what we call the fight or flight response. Okay, I'm sure everybody's heard that phrase before. This is the division that is responsible for our ability to run from a bear if it's attacking us. Okay, obviously life and death situation, right? Okay, basically anytime we need to be physically active, we're going to use the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, and it's going to cause things like increases in heart rate, increased release of sugar from our liver into the blood. We're going to breathe more rapidly. We're going to breathe more deeply. Our heart's going to beat harder. We're going to sweat. Well, in that case, a panic attack is where you're experiencing a fight or flight response, despite the fact that you're probably not actually exercising. Okay. The parasympathetic division produces a rest and digest response, where your body is doing normal resting conditions. Your heart rate's rather low. You're not sweating profusely. You're not breathing rapidly. You're secreting digestive juices like saliva and stomach juices, okay, so that you can rest and digest, okay? Now think of the relationship between sympathetic and parasympathetic like a teeter-totter, where if one is up, the other one is down. I look around the room, I look on the screen, I see signs of you guys experiencing which division? Parasympathetic, rest and digest, okay? What if I told you, okay, we've got 5 minutes, let's take that test today, right now. You got 5 minutes to take it, okay? What's gonna happen to you? You're gonna flip it on a dime, right? That teeter-totter is gonna go in the opposite direction. I'm gonna see people running out of the room. I might see somebody come try to fight me. That's fight or flight, okay? You're gonna experience a panic attack. Does that make sense? I'm not gonna do that to you. Don't worry.
I would cry.
Okay, the third division of the autonomic nervous system is what we call the ENS, enteric nervous system. This is the one that we don't talk as much about in this class. We'll get into it a lot when we talk about digestion, because that's what it helps regulate. It's associated with involuntary control of our gastrointestinal tract, GI tract for short. That's your stomach and your intestines, okay? It's an extensive network of neurons confined to the wall of our GI tract, regulating activity of the smooth muscle and the glands of our GI tract. Although it can function independently, it does communicate with and is regulated by the other branches of the ANS. Okay. In other words, these two divisions, sympathetic, parasympathetic, can influence the activity of the enteric. One of those divisions inhibits the enteric, one of them enhances it. Which of those do you think inhibits digestion and therefore the enteric nervous system? The sympathetic. Because if you're thinking about it like a life or death situation, running from a bear, is it important at that point to digest the breakfast that you had earlier in the day? Or is it more important to devote every single resource that we have to the muscles in our legs so we can run? Or if we have to fight? Okay. Literally the one that's called the rest and digest division enhances. The parasympathetic enhances the enteric nervous system. Okay. Now, the ENS sensory neurons that are within the walls of a tract can respond to changes like the stretch of the stomach when it fills up, or the change in pH. And then motor neurons are activated that control digestive function, which enables the stomach to start contracting and releasing juices and a whole bunch of stuff that we'll talk about when we get to the digestive lecture, which is much later in the semester. Now, you can think of your nervous system like a two-lane highway. And a two-lane highway means that you've got traffic going in two different directions, right? Okay. Well, both the PNS and the CNS include cells forming incoming and outgoing pathways, what we call the afferent and the efferent divisions. Okay, and those are illustrated here in our picture at the bottom, just kind of a schematic showing you the nervous system, where in the yellow box we have the CNS, and in the big purple box we have the PNS, and then subdivided down under the PNS will be the afferent and the efferent divisions. Okay. Afferent division is all of the incoming information. We always refer related to the central nervous system. So in other words, when we say incoming information, we're always going into the CNS. Okay. Often this can be classified as a sensory pathway. So when you see the term afferent and sensory, you can basically use them interchangeably, which if we go back to this slide, we said that the sensory function was performed by sensory or afferent neurons. Whereas the terms motor and efferent can get used interchangeably. Those are the outgoing signaling pathways. Okay. What we just talked about with somatic, autonomic, sympathetic, parasympathetic, enteric, we were just describing the efferent division or the motor division of our PNS, controlling things like our skeletal muscle, if we're talking somatic, controlling smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands, if we're talking sympathetic, parasympathetic, controlling stuff specific to the GI tract, if we're talking enteric. We will spend our third lecture, the final lecture of this unit, really kind of talking mainly about this stuff. We'll get into this stuff. That'll be our first lecture of unit 3. Okay, what we call the sensory and afferent nervous system, I think is the title of that. That's where we'll talk about sensations. We'll talk about the 5 special senses like vision, hearing, balance, smell, and taste. We'll talk about the not so special senses like touch and itch and tickle and hot and cold. Those are what we call somatic senses. So we'll kind of get into this in more detail later on. Now this is a perfect spot to stop because we can start fresh on Thursday after the exam by talking about neurons, which are the functional cells of the nervous system. Okay. If you guys have any questions, I will set you free.